I'd now like to introduce Dr. John Speir. Dr. Speir designs and implements simulation software tools for correctional systems to assess the impact of new policies and plan for the future. His tools are currently being used in Georgia, Alabama, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. So I'd now like to pass it over to John so he can begin his presentation.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Let me open my screen up here. All right, let's get started. My name is John Speir. Thank you for the time, and thank you for the introduction. My quick background, many of you may not be working in the area of sentencing and corrections, but it's a pretty large area in the U.S. and around the world, and it's really benefited a lot from the introduction of SIMUL8 and discrete event simulations, both for projecting prison populations, as well as a lot of other very specific facility issues, facility design, and I'll touch on those a little bit later if you have a question. Let me go ahead and move forward. The primary functional requirement that we find mostly in the United States and also in Canada too is forecasting inmate populations. With over 1 million people in Georgia prison, or excuse me, in U.S. prisons, and probably 20 or 30,000 in Canada, it's a fairly significant cost, and it means a lot to state governments as they struggle with, particularly with the shrinking tax revenue. They try to manage it as best they can. So how does SIMUL8 roll into this? We do a lot of legislative and impact analyses, in other words, fiscal implications. By that I mean statutory changes, policy changes, anything that could affect the overall prison population. Traditionally, they make these decisions and they don't give a lot of thought to the long-term impact, and that's where SIMUL8 has been very helpful. It does inform on certain types of models and personnel, facility, and program investments, but the biggest impact is the last one on the end there is a financial impact. One thing about corrections and sentencing, and a lot of people don't know this, is the absolute incredible cost associated with doing it. In Georgia, as an example, and I'm using the model there, we have about 55,000 people in prison. That's about $1 billion a year budget. All it takes is just a small change in that population, and you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. When I say that we've done changes to sentencing decisions, policy decisions in Georgia, we do a lot to support 3 or 4 major decisions. New construction, which, by the way, in most states is pretty limited right now. Leased space. Can we lease space more effectively than keeping it inside the prison system or a state-owned facility? And if you're doing sentencing changes, and this applies to the legislators, is it a good idea? And what's the impact of any decisions you make? And how much will you need to fund it? That's not typically been done in the past. By the way, one thing's for certain, this is a huge financial implication for everything they do. Using the model I'm about to describe to you, we've made decisions anywhere from $1 million up to $150 million decisions in terms of the impact that it would have. So it's an incredibly high risk, but endeavor when you're doing projections, but SIMUL8's really helped us get a handle on it, and it's proven over the last 13 years to be an incredible platform for doing it. Let me just give you a little overview of the model architecture in terms of how we set this projection of the prison population. One of which I'm going to show you is Georgia. It's a formal, or what I call a mature model. And by that, it integrates a lot of multiple software tools. And that's one of the points I want to make in this session, is that it really takes advantage of a lot of different software products out there. It's a little bit different than your typical SIMUL8 model. In this case, for work items, rather than creating statistical distribution, we actually read raw inmate records into it. In other words, we're reading up probably an area of 150,000 records into SIMUL8. SIMUL8 is very robust. It has no trouble processing those records. And you probably wonder, why do we do that? One reason is when it comes to creating what an offender looks like or an inmate going to prison, it's just too hard to model it with distributions to create someone who looks like an inmate. So we have to use actual records. We also, one thing about SIMUL8, and it's not discussed a lot, but it is a very powerful tool, is empirical distributions. In sentencing, as the judges hand out a sentence for prison, sometimes the sentences don't follow our normal parametric distributions. In fact, it may be hard to even model one yourself. So we found that in many cases, in many states, it's better to use what we call an empirical distribution. We use raw data from previous decisions to make our decisions and to make estimates. You may not be familiar with this part, but it's an incredibly important feature that SIMUL8 does have, and it is very useful, and that is we use an interface SIMUL8 with SQL Desktop Engine, a Microsoft product. It's actually a free product that you can load on your desktop, and the reason we do it that way is many users out there have a lot of data processing that goes into populating the SIMUL8 model. And rather than making it a start all over exercise every time they do it annually or twice annually when they do a projection, or even a scenario, we actually have integrated SQL Desktop Engine to work along with SIMUL8. If you go into your visual logic commands, you'll see references to get SQL model or get database fields. This is the feature that does it. It's incredibly powerful. It'll read this table extremely well. And so we can let the heavy lifting, as it were, be done by SQL Desktop Engine, and then preps the data for SIMUL8. This is as a mature model, and it's not required for all of it, because SIMUL8 would actually allow you to build a series of complex dialog boxes and menus. But for this client, we actually went out and developed our separate C# scenario manager. What's different it was it's an incredibly complex scenario manager, and it was just easier to do it this way. However, with that said, we often use and still do SIMUL8's dialog boxes, its interfaces, and all of the ability to customize SIMUL8 for a lot of scenarios that you just can't do through a, quote, wraparound software product, and I'll show you that in a second. We also, interesting part is, very important features, SIMUL8 works well, again, with another platform, which is Crystal Reports. We actually write the result, any projections that are done over, let's say, 5 years, and we write the results out to a SQL database, and then it gets picked up by Crystal Reports, and off you go. You can actually have a Crystal Report. So the inability to work SIMUL8 into other products is sometimes not discussed a lot, but it's an incredibly powerful feature for us. I'll show you what's called a scenario manager. Now SIMUL8 has its own scenario manager, but for many clients, you got to keep in mind, some of our clients around the country don't always have, and some states do, have a lot of staff that can work on these things. But many of them may be one person, 2 people, and they don't have time to do a lot of SIMUL8 programming, or even sometimes not even get to know it. So sometimes we sort of come along and have created a wraparound product that does it for you. Now it'll cover about 75% of the cases in this particular one, but the other 25%, which are very complex scenarios that may not be amenable to the dialog boxes that we've created, you can do yourself in SIMUL8, and we do that all the time. And I'll just give you an example. It's a very simple model. There's really nothing very complex, particularly to those who've been doing operations research, where it only involves a certain number of objects. We don't use resources, and we run by the days, so we don't run by minutes or hours, obviously. And we run over 60 months, about a 5-year period by the day. Up on the top left, where you see GDC scribe or inmate stock, those are the active inmates. So one thing SIMUL8 has to do, similar to sort of a warm-up, it actually populates the prison system with active inmates. And we literally read the actual records of inmates in the system, which for policymakers is very appealing. They really relate to it when I open a dialog box, or excuse me, open one of the objects in the queue, and show them an actual offender of real data. We then feed commitments. Now, one thing about this type of model is when it comes to commitments, what I mean by that, that's the number of people arriving. It's sort of our inter-arrival rate, I guess. We do that outside SIMUL8. We use ARIMA. We use a lot of expert groups to get together to decide how many inmates do we expect to populate our system next year. We make that decision. And all along the way, we have a lot of math that's getting done in terms of assessing likely sentence, time served that they're going to serve in prison, when they get out, how they get out, how long they move to special programs. You'll see we often run males and females, and as a basic model, I'm only keeping it males and females, but SIMUL8 has the ability to break it down into very specific offender populations, which we often do in the reports. So it's a fairly basic model, but behind it there's a lot going on. This is a very busy screen, and I apologize, but it really gives you sort of a sense of how much flow is going on between SIMUL8 and the other products that I described earlier. This is SIMUL8, the model you just saw, and we're passing data back and forth from SQL Desktop Engine. will often go to the desktop engine to tell it to execute certain data manipulation functions. It reads data in, so it handles all of our importing abilities, and then it passes the data back to Simulate. I'll show you in a second a scenario manager we use, again, that interfaces nicely with Simulate, that tells Simulate how to read this data and what to do with it on a particular simulation run. The results are then passed over to our database of the projections, let's say, and then we write it out to a crystal report or an Excel spreadsheet, which Simulate does really well. We have hundreds of different scenarios that we can run, which often come up every legislative session. I described a C# scenario manager, and this is a multi-agency tool. So 3 agencies signed up for it because they all have a vested interest in running this product. We have it tabbed out, and again, all this is doing is collecting input from the user about what type of scenario they want to run, what assumptions they're making, and what the scenario is. It then passes that information to SQL Server, where the database is crunched, and after that, Simulate picks the database out of SQL, imports it, executes the simulation, writes the results back out to SQL Server, which we then display in a crystal report. Can you do all of this without these tools? Yes. You do not necessarily have to have any of these to do what I'm describing. Again, this is built for an organization that has very limited resources and need all the help they can in moving things along. But it can be done within Simulate. In fact, one of the largest prison populations in the state, which is Texas, they built one completely and still run it every day without any of these types of other tools. So it's very doable. This is just an inside shot of our scenario manager. We keep up with everything, and up at the top you'll see things that are very scenario specific. These are things that states want to test. So it's very much like a scenario that you run on some particular area that you're working in. We just happen to build it here and then pass the data to Simulate. Here's an example of one of our little options, which is all the crimes that are out there. We have a whole bunch of them. I just happen to have the drug crimes up. And in this case, the user can manipulate with the sentences, how they want to change sentences. They want to lower them, increase them, whether they want to make them eligible to be paroled. Again, once it's all saved in a table, Simulate picks it up and runs the simulation model. It's an incredibly sweet little feature. It does a really nice job in doing it. We have it running in probably about a dozen states. Some have gone out on their own. We're not necessarily involved in all of them. Texas is a great example. It's also under development in Canada right now. I'm working with them there. It's used in jails too. The difference if you're not prison and jail person, prisons are long-term incarceration, usually run by the central government, state government, as where jails are more local detention populations in a particular community. We've just now, in the last 2 years, gotten involved in jails. They seem to work really nicely. They have very fast turnoving populations, so Simulate really works well with those. And we've had shaping sentencing reform, which is the last bullet, in about 5 states. And what I mean by that, Simulate's been used in probably, if you get to it, the impact that it's helped and the decisions it's helped guide is probably closing in on $1 billion. I've worked in about 5 states that have undertaken major reform, and the decisions that came out of Simulate have helped shape legislators' decisions about how to save money, build, not build, and effectively, in the end, it's several $1 million, hundreds of $1 million for each one of these states. So it's been an incredibly valuable tool. I'm very fortunate that I got a hold of this project 13, 14 years ago, and it's been an important part of our work, and it's also been used successfully in other states. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, John. I think that's a very interesting look into the criminal justice sector. Might be a sector that some of our users online right now might not be as familiar with. Also thought it was great insight on importing all that large amount of data using SQL. So again, to all our viewers, if you do have any additional questions for John, please type them into the chat panel now. John, I have received one question for you here. It's in terms of that interface that you've created. Just how much time have you invested in that front end for the the justice system, and how much time does it save on new projects?
Good question. At first, the very first time we did it, it probably took about 3 months to put it together. We try to stay around with the same concept for everybody, so about 3 months of work. But that was about 9 years ago, and since then, we don't have to go back, and since, like I said, 75% of the decisions can be changed or manipulated with that interface. So in the long term, is it cost effective or not? For certain clients. It's not necessarily a good thing for all clients. For example, Canada is a good example. Incredibly talented people up there, and they really have some sharp people, and they don't need those types of interfaces. They just work it within SIMUL8 and do quite well. And I think Texas is the same way. But other clients, they need it. They think it saves on time, they're short-staffed, or, and more importantly, they have a lot of turnover a lot of times. In that case, they're always bringing someone new along. So it really was proved cost-effective.
Sure.
I see a question, another one up here. California, I see that question. No, I have not worked in California. And I've studied it a lot. I'm very familiar with what's going on out there. I thought for a while we might be out there, but I'm not sure what tool they're using. I'd be interested to find that out if you happen to know.
Okay, great. I think we've got another question quickly for you, John. And it's just simply, how does C# interface with SIMUL8?
C#, I guess it's sort of indirectly with it. We can, for most of the parameters that are captured, because that's all C# is doing, is just capturing data parameters. Most of the time we're passing that information directly to SQL Server table and storing the parameter there, at which point SIMUL8 picks it up and reads it out of SQL Server. However, there's a couple places where we're actually passing commands and parameters back and forth. Not for all of them. I think we do it for a handful of them. But we've never had any problems with this doing it. We've been quite successful in passing parameters back and forth, or receiving parameters out of SIMUL8 into C#. C#, if you're not familiar with, similar to Visual Basic, I guess, and those types of packages.
Sure.
But it's really been very successful. It's worked really well. Have not yet run into a platform that SIMUL8 won't work with.
Okay. Just looking at seeing if there's any other questions. Again, if you guys have any questions, you can send them through to the chat panel there, and we can always send them through to John to get answered. Just another quick question for you, John. Do you do any optimization? And if yes, is that inside or outside of using SIMUL8?
Oh, that's a good question. I have not done. We have done optimization on other smaller prison models that don't handle as many records, and I won't get into those. But we have done it once or twice. The only thing about doing optimization, and it is a valuable feature, where we've been able to set the parameters up and then ask SIMUL8 to look for the optimal solution. The only issue for clients, and sometimes they're in a hurry, and it is a fairly computationally intensive run. Just make sure you have time when you do it. And also, another thing, be very careful when you craft the parameters for it. Not to be too expansive, because it could run for a long time, longer than you really want it to. So yes, we have done it. We often will do single point estimates without a trial to sort of figure out what the lay of the land on a particular scenario. And then at that point, we then run a full trial. And remember, we're running probably in any one 60-month period, we may be processing 250,000 work items, or 300,000, depending on the prison system. And so it can be computationally intensive, which means sometimes we do let it run overnight, and if it's that large one. But usually the models are pretty efficient. Especially, I've been with SIMUL8 now for 13 years, and the processing speed's been incredible each year. But yeah, optimization is important. It's especially when you're dealing with sentencing decision. It's very, very nice feature to have.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that, John. Just again, for all our viewers, we will be posting all of these slides and the recording of this presentation online. Should you have any other questions, we will have some contact details at the end of this, if there's anything else that you would like to touch upon. Okay, so yeah, great. Thanks for that, John.